Well, good afternoon. It is such a pleasure to be here in this space today and for a couple of days here at Chautauqua. My first time being here, and it has certainly met the expectations that I had for it after hearing the experience of several friends and colleagues who have been here in the past. I certainly want to thank Executive Director Hill for that very gracious introduction. I'm also grateful to the selection committee for inviting me to give this lecture at the African American Heritage House. It was a tremendous honor and privilege to be invited, given the long lineage and history of others who have taken this platform and been in this space, broadly speaking. And I appreciate it because such opportunities, I do believe, gives us an opportunity to come together and engage one another and learn from one another in this very important space. Now, I must begin by saying that I am not a musician, although I like to say I played at a saxophone during my teenage years, nor am I a jazz historian or teacher of music theory. I am just someone trained in moral philosophy and religious social ethics, working in bioethics, who loves the music and loves hanging around artists as they engage in their craft. And I am one who has found in jazz, understood as more than a music, resources that I think can shape the ethical life. Now, I'm not foolish enough to believe that everyone is here because they like jazz music. I suspect a few of you may be here because you're wondering what kind of Jedi mind trick I may be trying to pull off by bringing these ideas and conversation together. I don't think, though, that one has to like jazz music to really appreciate what some of the motifs we find in jazz, understood as more than a music, can contribute to our thinking about moral practices. And this afternoon, I do want to focus more so on the moral practice of kind of medicine and healthcare, broadly speaking, and how it relates to movements for health justice. Now, as a philosopher, I do like to make certain distinctions and try to define particular terms. So following moral philosophers like Alistair McIntyre, I understand a moral practice as an activity in which people work together, using specific skills and methods toward a shared goal. Further, the goals, including the habits and dispositional traits necessary for achieving those goals, themselves are considered good for the professional practice and for the society at large. Now, of course, talk of some broad notion of the good is notoriously complex and vigorously debated amongst philosophers, theologians, and ethicists. These conversations can be exasperating to seasoned scholars, and certainly this is the case with informed lay people thinking about such ideas. Now, without getting into the weeds and controversies of this topic, I acknowledge that notions of the good are more easily appealed to than the actual content determined. Nevertheless, I take it that professional healthcare is a broad set of moral practices with goals, maybe not always well defined, with some internal values to itself. And the values of various forms of healthcare interact and intersect with broader sets of social values that can support or actually be in tension with it in various encounters. Now, given that there may be very many experienced musicians and artists in this space here who know much more about these motifs that I highlight in my reflections, and given that many others of you are in very different contexts than healthcare, I want to make sure we save a little time for us to be able to riff off of one another regarding some of these ideas, so that perhaps it can be generative for shaping the way we think about the ethical life, regardless of our stations of life. Now, those of us who may have some awareness of jazz performance may see the vibrant, seemingly joyful appearance of artists and the relaxed settings people often inhabit during these performances as conveying a deep sense of joy and freedom, perhaps rightfully so. Maybe there are images conjured up of laid back, relaxed, chilled out, and cool cats jamming on instruments and creating experiences of catharsis for all those participating when they find the groove or are in the pocket, as some musicians say. Some of us may have the added stereotype of some musician who is able to have an entire conversation with you while holding a lit cigarette between his lips without ever taking it out. I don't know, which is a very fascinating feat for those who haven't seen such a thing before. The outward appearance of joy and deep ecstatic experiences that some have when engaging this music could possibly, just possibly, obscure some important features about jazz understood as more than a music. To appreciate this, I think it is important to remember that jazz, as a distinctively African-American generated musical art form with worldwide impact, coming together around the turn of the 20th century. I want to suggest that awareness of the socio-political and historical context of where jazz came from is important to note to understand how jazz can inform the ethical life and the perspective taking that I think is important to appreciate when integrating these ideas. Its birthplace is said to be in New Orleans. Early accounts describe how the Spanish, who let their Catholicized slaves have Sundays off, would gather in Congo Square. Congo Square is the southern part of Armstrong Park in New Orleans and played a central role in the development of jazz. Here, these enslaved people of the 19th century would play African music characterized by accented offbeat rhythms that would become a fundamental feature in the development of this music that would be called jazz. The music contained elements of slave songs, the spirituals, bent blue notes, and African drum rhythms, along with many other features. Award-winning music historian Ted Gioia brings this together when he writes these words. He says, no urban area on the planet offered a more diverse cultural mix during the years leading up to the emergence of jazz than New Orleans. New Orleans was the melting pot within the larger melting pot of American life. And when vibrant cultural traditions are forced into such close interaction and exposed to so many disparate influences, exciting new hybrids invariably emerge from the mix. In this instance, the result was jazz, a distinctive performance style created by Black Americans who drew on and added to the extraordinary musical ecosystem of the turn of the century New Orleans. When we listen to the ways New Millennium jazz mixes effortlessly with Latin and Caribbean currents or with the formal structures of Western classical music, Gioia says, we are experiencing a continuation of the cultural dialogue that presided over the idiom's birth. So around the time when jazz emerged on the scene, New Orleans also was said to be one of the unhealthiest cities in the United States. The yellow fever epidemic raged through the city in 1878. Black infant mortality in the city at the time was 45%, and the typical lifespan of an African American was only 36 years. All cities had to deal with public health risk, but New Orleans was especially dangerous, according to some historians, because of its particular mix of well-traveled residents, climate, population density, and poor local sanitation. One cannot forget the deep racial discrimination, social injustice, and economic exploitation that was being experienced by African American people at this time in that space. Now, of course, there were many from other racial and ethnic backgrounds experiencing various forms of discrimination, exploitation, and poverty in that context. This is important to note. And it is also important to note and emphasize, for the purposes of this occasion at the African American Heritage House, the social marginalization of Black people in this context. And so, jazz vocalist Ruth Naomi Floyd can say without hyperbole, I believe, that jazz is the art form born of oppression and pain. This, I would suggest, is crucial to keep in mind when thinking about jazz as more than a music and reflecting on it for the ethical life. Now, like many of you, perhaps, I think there is something powerful about the musical arts and all of the arts, really. And I think there is something interesting about jazz to explore, being what some working in aesthetics would call an imperfect art. Following those in aesthetic philosophy, we can think about jazz being an imperfect art in contrast with other forms of art. The very nature of jazz demands a kind of spontaneity within parameters. Often improvised art is considered by some to be a kind of second-rate art, as art which is necessarily less worthy of our attention than that which is the result of careful planning all the way through from beginning to end. And so many of the virtues that those working in aesthetics sometimes search for in other forms of art, things such as premeditated design, balance between form and content, and overall symmetry, are often absent in jazz, or maybe at least not represented in the same degree, or to the same degree, in the same ways. So then our question is, can this imperfect art of jazz stand alongside other forms of art such as poetry, painting, and the literary arts, etc., in the realm of aesthetic beauty? It's probably not going to surprise you that I actually think so. I'll return again to music historian Ted Gioia, and I follow his judgment here when he writes these words: clearly, any set of aesthetic standards which perfection or near perfection in the work of art will find little to praise in jazz. Yet this approach, however prevalent, is not the only valid way of evaluating works of art. A contrasting, if not complementary, attitude looks not at the art in isolation, but in relation to the artist who created it. It asks whether that work is expressive of the artist, whether it reflects their own unique and incommensurable perspective on their art, whether it makes a statement without which the world would be in some small way a lesser place. This, I believe, Gioia writes, is precisely the attitude towards art that delights in jazz. Now, this orientation is, of course, at odds with certain Enlightenment ways of thinking about the notion of beauty and art. Nevertheless, maybe, just maybe, we can still draw some reflections from this imperfect art generated by imperfect people for our imperfect moral practices as we seek to navigate an imperfect world. Before turning to these themes, these jazz motifs that I hope can inform the ethical life, let me just broadly identify a perennial problem for the moral practice of healthcare, namely the persistence of health and healthcare disparities along racialized lines. In a space like this, I will not dare insult your intelligence nor test your patience by rehearsing these data. And so I will be summative here by noting that there is an extensive body of research detailing the significant health and healthcare gaps between racial and ethnic minorities and their white counterparts. Racial and ethnic minorities have poor health outcomes, experience a lower quality of service when engaging healthcare, receive basic medical procedures at a lesser rate, shorter life expectancies, and have more significant challenges accessing healthcare, generally speaking, than white Americans. These sorts of disparities were analyzed over 20 years ago, culminating in a report from the National Academy of Medicine titled Unequal Treatment: Confronting Racial and Ethnic Disparities in Healthcare, published in 2003. Now, the report noted that the sources of these disparities range across various levels of the health sector, including the patient level, provider level, process level, and system level. The main thing to keep in mind at this point is how extensive and intensive these matters are for the health sector and for U.S. society. Now, a legitimate question can be raised here. Where do things stand 2 decades after unequal treatment? According to a prominent participant in the original project, David Williams of Harvard School of Public Health, says not as much has changed regarding the findings of the report as many had initially hoped. To be sure, there has been some progress in researchers noting a greater sense of awareness as to how racial disparities in health outcomes and health care is a problem for the health sector. Yet, after accounting for health care access differentials, the severity of diseases, and socioeconomic status, the racial disparities found 20 years earlier by and large persist. These are not just broad, abstract data points. Behind these data stand real people, and real communities stand and fall behind them. These are people to whom many of us have very real responsibilities. Dr. Susan Moore, a Black woman and physician, died from COVID-19 in 2020. She posted an extremely distressing video from her hospital bed describing racist treatment she received by those who were tasked to provide care for her. The concerns she expressed about her condition and testimony as to what she was experiencing in her body as a result of this illness was not taken seriously. And as a result, she continued to experience pain, further deterioration in her bodily systems, and she eventually died. Just 3 years before this, Serena Williams, a former world-class professional tennis player and champion in 2017, was having her first child. This experience became life-threatening when the care team did not respond to her concerns regarding her history of pulmonary embolisms, given her shortness of breath. She had to insist that they run proper tests and give her the relevant treatments before the care team discovered that she was correct about what was happening to her. A proper, timelier response would have required minor intervention. Instead, it resulted in her being bedbound for over a month as a new mother. Now, some may think that these are cases of medical error. After all, physicians and nursing teams are under stress and pressure too. They are not always able to do all they want to do or desire to do. And while it may be true that healthcare professionals often are under immense pressure and sometimes are caring for people under intense circumstances, there is perhaps more going on in cases like this. The stories of Dr. Susan Moore and Serena Williams are just, unfortunately, two examples of experiences of Black women with health care that can be multiplied many times over. These experiences can be understood as instances of medical racism. Researchers, social scientists, and ethicists have also shown the connection between these disparities along racialized lines and the history and sordid legacy of racism. Medical racism contains both interpersonal and institutional dimensions and leads to disparate treatment in clinical encounters, poorer health outcomes, and a kind of social marginalization. So let me share two examples of the complex and multi-dimensional ways this can play out. First, consider again the case of Serena Williams. This, I'd argue, was not a case of class bias or a lack of health literacy in terms of the reasons why her concerns were not initially considered accurate and valid. Clearly, as a world-class athlete, she is aware of what is going on in her body. And as a wealthy professional athlete with affluence, she certainly would not fall in the category of being marginalized along socioeconomic lines. Linda Villarosa, a researcher, aptly summarizes the data surrounding the connection of racism to the stark contrast of Black women with their similarly situated counterparts of other backgrounds concerning their reproductive health and questions of infant mortality. And listen to these words that she wrote. The reasons for the Black-white divide in both infant and maternal mortality have been debated by researchers and doctors for more than 2 decades. But recently there has been a growing acceptance of what has largely been for the medical establishment a shocking idea. For Black women in America, an inescapable atmosphere of societal and systemic racism can create a kind of toxic physiological stress resulting in conditions including hypertension and preeclampsia that lead directly to higher rates of infant mortality and maternal death. And that societal racism is further expressed in a pervasive, long-standing racial bias in healthcare, including the dismissal of legitimate concerns and symptoms that can help explain poor birth outcomes, even in the case of Black women with the most advantages. Now, a second example that I'd argue highlights both the interpersonal and institutional dimensions of medical racism that leads to disparate treatment, in clinical encounters, poor health outcomes, and social marginalization is racial bias in pain assessment and corresponding treatment recommendations. There was the belief that Black people did not experience pain in the same way as white people. This theory was prevalent during the antebellum era of enslavement and was used to justify many forms of brutality and abuse at the hands of slave owners and physicians operating within the political economy of American slavery. Now, while we may regard these beliefs as perhaps misguided and biologically inaccurate, we still find their vestiges among us today, demonstrating both the tenacity and the resiliency of these racially imagined beliefs. Such is shown in the fact that as recently as 2016, a study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences found that a substantial number of white lay people and medical students and residents continue to hold false beliefs about biological differences between blacks and whites in relation to the experience of pain. And their findings demonstrated that these beliefs predicted racial bias not only in pain perception, but also in treatment recommendation accuracy. The authors summarized their findings stating that, taken together, this work provides evidence that false beliefs about biological differences between blacks and whites continues to shape the way we perceive and treat black people, and they are associated with racial disparities in pain assessment and treatment recommendations. Now, as we transition to some of these themes that emerge in jazz, we recognize that addressing racism in medicine and health disparities along racialized lines is a tall order, and even more so when placed in the context of larger social and systemic dynamics that directly and negatively impact health and human well-being for many. So the question here at this point is, what beats can we hit to create rhythms regarding our interactions with healthcare that are marked by attention to equity and towards broader notions of health justice? Though there are many ways this can be done, let me briefly highlight three major themes from jazz, understood again as more than a music, for us to reflect upon that I hope can stir our moral imagination. The first motif I want to highlight is that of syncopation. Syncopation is being aware of the main beats and the off beats. You accent that which was always there but hasn't been heard. The idea I want to raise here regarding syncopation is the emphasis on finding the beat on the offbeat, accenting rhythms that run within or even counter to the dominant momentum of an institution to uncover or reveal a rhythm that was otherwise hidden. Of course, other forms of music use syncopation, but as others have said, jazz is syncopation gone mad. The idea is closely related to the idea of swing. Jazz swings. That is, it picks up momentum, presses forward, and searches for what is to come. Swing is that basic unit of rhythm. It is being aware of the main beats and the offbeats. You accent that which has always been there, but hasn't been heard. So learning the art of syncopation makes us much more aware of the moment, the rhythm. Syncopation helps us to notice the unnoticed. Given the breadth of existing documentation regarding racial, ethnic, and socioeconomic healthcare quality disparities, it is worth noting that patients of color and of lower socioeconomic status often do not have access to and receive the same quality of healthcare, often, though not always, due to certain elements within U.S. healthcare. Moreover, the racialized dimension of this problem goes beyond questions of class or socioeconomic status. And so I want to argue that healthcare providers, ethicists, sociologists, chaplains, and others working in various spaces arrive at a sense of respect for patients and move towards quality healthcare when they take seriously the experiences and voices of those marginalized by structural inequalities. The application of syncopation extends beyond interpersonal encounters to how the history of medical ethics and more broadly bioethics is actually told. In our recounting of the history of medical ethics, we need to have the ability to identify those people and movements and issues that have not been part of the original telling of the story. So here again, syncopation is being aware of the main beats and the off beats. We accent that which was always there, but has not been fully heard. The second motif from jazz I want to highlight for our consideration is improvisation. Improv, or infinite play, as some would say, is the infinite possibility of creative solution and generosity of work, and what that has to say about hope and moving forward toward what we cannot yet see. Other forms of music may employ improvisation, but jazz in jazz, it is expected. Some would go so far as to say that if there is no improvisation, there is no jazz. To compose in the moment can be a risky enterprise, no doubt, and yet it is a necessary condition of the genre, according to some philosophers of jazz as they debate. And yes, there are such things as philosophers of jazz, right? And philosophers of music. I've read some, right? I can point at them if you don't believe me, right? There is a kind of freshness to the music, and this necessary condition of the genre of improvisation is that which allows jazz to exist, as some would say, in a continual state of renewal. Just think about that for a moment, right? Continual state of renewal. The freshness of the music. Improvisation is often seen as an essential, if not the essential characteristic. It is improvisation that makes the playing of the same old song, so to speak, seem like a new song every time it is performed, because it is a music of traditions and freedom. The idea that jazz is a music of traditions and freedoms, I want to stress, is important to keep in mind. As one ethicist has noted, improvisation is the willingness to live within the bounds of the past and yet to search for the future at the same time. Improvisation is the desire to make something new out of something old. It is the craving to respect tradition while at the same time leaving one's own mark. Improvisation is having a plan and yet not being incarcerated by that plan. It is experiencing being open to letting the people around you, whether they are in the band or spectators in the audience, to have input into the impact on what you are creating. Improvisation, I think, is about being so familiar with one's instrument of choice, the song, and the essentials that we can trust ourselves to search for the unseen for what the moment is presenting. The training healthcare providers receive and the trainees are receiving is of utmost importance in any type of profession whatsoever. In particular, medical professionals are intimately familiar or ought to be with the relevant biological sciences important for their specialty. They're ingrained with the essential tools that can help diagnose and treat or engage in relevant kinds of medical research and to address all sorts of public health challenges. It is this deep familiarity with the relevant medical science and judgments that have been cultivated in seeing patients over a course of a career that allows for the kind of trust to search for creative ways in moments of uncertainty. And if the ethical life or just our lives in general is anything, it certainly can be marked by periods of uncertainty. It is creativity within the bounds of tradition. The same can be said of those doing work in medical ethics. It is important to know the basic contours of the field, yes, the key issues, various methodologies and debates that have shaped the field and the inherited traditions, and yet each generation coming in the field needs to create new pathways forward for changing times while building off or maybe even deviating from that which has come before. Even in those times when it is felt that a move in a radically different direction is needed, one still needs to be acquainted enough with that which has come before. It is important to generate new ideas for emerging medical, technological, and social challenges that are facing modern healthcare. And attention to this notion of improvisation can perhaps help us with this. In terms of clinical encounters, the notion of improvisation helps healthcare providers learn to grow with each clinical encounter, because in jazz, if it really is jazz according to some, that's marked by improvisation, you never play the same song twice. Every patient encounter is a different encounter, even if it is a familiar diagnosis, say. I think this has broader implications, right? Even though we categorize ourselves in different ways in our body politics or in our communities or our social lives, and we may be able to label one another in different ways, let us never forget that each individual encounter with a particular person is a unique instance that we have to attend seriously to the person. It is important that we generate these ideas and new ways of being together in the challenges that we face. The theme of improvisation reminds us that there are creative possibilities that can happen by listening to the unique perspective and experiences of people in the particular moment in time in which we encounter them. Being aware of the nature of improvisation reminds us to be present fully in the moment. It reminds us to be attentive to the needs of one another at the particular time. The third motif from jazz I want to highlight for our consideration is economy of play, or some would call it call and response. Economy of play is a deep sense of give and take. It is a mutuality that is helpful and not begrudging, neither procedural nor merely, okay, now it's your turn to play, I guess. The notion is relational, and it reflects a communal way of life. Everyone is involved. There is not merely a performer on stage, spectators in the audience, and sound engineers controlling technical components. Musicians are often calling to each other, and they respond. The group, those in the audience, call out to the group of musicians calls out to the audience, and they are conditioned to respond. The audience then calls out to the musicians, and the musicians respond. It is a moment of mutuality and deep relationality. It requires an economy of generosity marked by community, calling people in instead of calling people out. How does this musical art, jazz, understood as more than a music, generate radical giving within the community? I think being aware of the notion of polyphony is important here. Polyphony is the style of simultaneously combining several parts, each forming an individual melody and harmonizing with each other. This notion highlights the importance of multiple voices and multiple melodies. I think this is an important ethical metaphor. And even if we add to it that some of the instruments that are part of jazz ensembles initially weren't meant to be together, right? Some of those instruments are just not supposed to go together. But yet they were coming together and something beautiful and imaginative was created. Attention to call and response and polyphony helps not only cultivate the skill of being fully present to one another, but also more fully responsive to marginalized communities when providing health care and when these groups are interacting with the healthcare system. It helps providers to be able to step back from the immediate dialogue and events in order to be cognizant of the larger picture. Part of being responsible requires self-reflection, both on how one may be perceived in a context and on the actual effects of one's actions and decisions. Each of these three themes, syncopation, improvisation, and call and response, requires something. It requires a notion of deep listening. I want to suggest for us today that paying attention to jazz as more than a music can help us embrace a recommitment to the kind of solidarity that is necessary to move towards justice in health and healthcare. This is a recommitment, a reaffirmation of a kind of solidarity that is a unity among people within social organization. It is to have a firm commitment to the common good of all people, especially to those on the margins. Now, I want to argue that we understand the common good, that we ought to understand the common good as a good for all, not a good for each member of a given society. In the sense, it is not to be understood as the greatest good for the greatest number of people. The common good language I'm employing here reflects a broader characteristic of our social world. It points to the material conditions in which people live and how we arrange our social lives that impact how we do life together and the way we bump into each other. Social arrangements, so shaped by policies, laws, and practices, matter with respect to promoting or stifling human flourishing. The common good reflects the degree to which the social conditions enable members of a given society to flourish. So working for the common good means working against poverty. It means working against racism, sexism, and any other forms of social marginalization that stifle human well-being. Further, commitments to the common good require that we continue to expand our moral universe into the realm of environmental concerns and ecological justice. A commitment to solidarity, then, is a realization that all inhabitants of this great world house are now and will continue to be neighbors, brought into being largely because of the modern scientific technological revolutions. Thus, people have obligations to work on behalf of one another. Solidarity requires a deep and radical commitment to those who may be part of, as Howard Thurman says, the diminished, the disinherited, the disenfranchised, or those whose backs are already against the wall. A commitment to solidarity requires both individual and communal introspection and action. Individually, solidarity also invites us to consider whether our own behaviors and mentalities demonstrate a concern with those on society's margins. Communally, solidarity challenges us to ask whether the social organizations of which we are part strengthen the bonds of human friendship, especially the bond between those with and those without sufficient resources. If our schools and institutions and broader associated social organizations are not doing these kinds of things well, then we must seek systemic changes that improve our capacity to enable such relationships, especially since so much data points to the deleterious effects of all of these issues on how we can flourish as a society. Maybe these reflections from an imperfect art, all that jazz, we may say, can be of help with guiding these processes and navigating uncertain terrain. Considering the systemic nature of the problem, ways forward require both individual and communal responses within healthcare and outside of it to reassess our broader societal values. Maybe attention to syncopation, improvisation, and call and response can help us find various pathways towards health justice. Maybe, just maybe, syncopation can help us see the unseen and hear the unheard by paying attention to the margins. Maybe, just maybe, attention to improv can shape our hearts and minds to understand the past in ways that we can imagine and invent a new future. Maybe, just maybe, call and response can inspire us to embed ourselves in a kind of relationality that can lift all of us. Maybe this is the kind of healthcare, this kind of social medicine perhaps, might just move us to a kind of healing that we also desperately need. Thank you so very much.